think it's fair to say that one of the most difficult and challenging books of the Bible for anybody to read and understand is the book of Revelation. It's a book of prophecy with a lot of symbolism, a lot of metaphorical language, a lot of things that are difficult to understand, and some descriptions of things that are honestly quite frightening and unfathomable for us to really imagine. Outside of just that, there's also the fact that there's lots of different interpretations of this book on the table. There's at least 4 main views of the book, and all of them are in contention with each other in one way or another. What this all adds up to, I think, is a rather intimidating book to get into for most people, myself included. In fact, it's a book that I kind of just stayed away from for the majority of my Christian life. I always figured it was probably a little bit above my pay grade to try to understand what was going on in this book. Well, that did change recently because I ended up having a good reason that I needed to get into this book and study it. The youth Sunday school class I run really wanted to, and I didn't want to let them down. So I did the best I could. I dove into it, I looked up a whole bunch of commentaries on it, and I don't know exactly what I was expecting to find, but I'm pretty sure I wasn't expecting what I did find, and that was a lot of evidence for a view that I thought sounded completely outlandish for the longest time. That view of the book is called preterism. And if you haven't heard of this word before, it's just the view that the majority of the prophecy in Revelation, specifically everything up to about verse 20, has actually already happened in human history, specifically in the first century. Now, I know this probably sounds crazy. It sounded crazy to me too. I mean, there's a lot of language in here that doesn't sound like anything we've seen. And yet, if we slow down and appreciate the symbolism of a lot of the things that are being described and look at what actually occurred in the first century, there's a lot of things that line up really well. I definitely won't be able to go through all of that. I'm still learning a lot about this myself, but there's 2 pieces of evidence that I found really interesting personally that I figured other people might find interesting. So if you're new to this, this is just an introductory step. Hopefully it gets you interested, and if it does, go find smarter scholars who can explain this stuff better than I can. All that being said, the 2 things I wanted to talk about were the beast and its mark, and the whore of Babylon and how that relates to the tribulation. Both of these things from the perspective of interpretations on how they showed up in the first century. So to start, let's talk about the beast. If you're not immediately familiar with this is the big, scary, demonic thing that shows up. We're told lots about it. The really important things is that it's empowered by Satan in some way. It rules over the earth. It persecutes Christians. It's worshipped like a god. And that it has 7 heads, which mean specific things. And those heads are a good place to start because a little bit later on in the book, after its initial description, we're told what these heads represent, specifically that they represent 7 hills and 7 kings. And this is kind of a weird thing from the beginning, especially the hills part. It seems kind of random. With the kings, it's easier to understand how this could apply to some sort of satanic force in the world, and yet we're told a detail that might be a bit perplexing, and that's that 5 of them were. So 5 of these kings already have been here and are gone. 1 of them currently is, so we're under the rule of it at the time of the writing of the book, and 1 of them is yet to come for only a short time. And this is immediately where there's a suggestion that this has already happened. After all, 5 of them were, and 1 of them is. Reading it 2,000 years later, we then should suspect immediately that we should go back and look at how this might apply to the first century. So all that being said, is there anything in the first century that lines up with a lot of these details? And the answer is yes, and that is the pagan Roman Empire. First off, Rome was built famously on 7 hills, which immediately gives us a check mark. In the first century, it was known for persecuting Christians as the religion was beginning to spread. It's another check mark. We also know that at the time we can look at a group of 7 emperors who fit the description of a king pretty well, that being Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, and Otho. So there's candidates for the 7 kings. And were these kings worshipped like a god? Well, in some respect, yes. The Roman emperors were treated in some way like a deity. So there's another check mark. The other interesting thing about looking at it in this way, besides everything that lines up fairly nicely, is the timing of it all. Because if we go back to that 5 already were, 1 is, and 1 is coming. That would put us in the reign of the 7th of that list, that being Galba. Historically, that means that the book was probably written somewhere in the year 68 AD, which fits pretty well. That's pretty much close to the time we might expect this book to have been written. It also ends up lining up really well with the second part of what I want to talk about, which we'll get to in a little bit. All that being said, though, at the very least, there's a candidate for what could be this beast then. There is something in history at the time of the writing of the book of Revelation that lines up well with a lot of what the beast is described to do. But it does go a little bit further than that, and that's where we get into the mark of the beast. This is another detail that's fairly popular, but in case you haven't heard it, we're told that this beast will have a mark that will somehow be applied to its followers. And for today, the details I want to talk about is specifically that we're told that this mark is the number 666, and it's the number of a man, which John says the people at the time should be able to calculate. That's a really interesting detail. From today's perspective, calculating the number of a man doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We don't really do that anymore, but in the context of first century Jews, Christians, Romans, there was a practice that lines up with this called gematria. This is rooted in the fact that at the time, the alphabet and the numbering system all shared the same characters. So where we have ABC 1, 2, 3, they just had letters that were also numbers. And what this meant is that people could look at words or names and actually calculate the number of them because they were both a word and a number. So if we look at our kings then that we think applies to this beast, does this mark 666 apply to any of them? Do any of their names add up to this number? And the answer is yes. Nero Caesar, spelt out in Arabic or Hebrew, when used with gematria, the calculating of names to numbers, does add up to 666. Additionally, there's actually 2 ways to spell Nero Caesar. One of them adds up to 666, as I said. The other one adds up to 616, which you might think would cause issues for this view until we discover that there's actually ancient manuscripts that have both of these numbers in them. Not in one manuscript, but there's manuscripts with 666 and manuscripts with 616. And the whole point is this suggests that at the time, there were at least some people who were probably interpreting the mark of the beast and who this applies to in this way. They were seeing that, okay, this applies to Nero Caesar. And some people spelling it out using one pronunciation of it were seeing that, well, this adds up to 616. But being sure it applied to Caesar, they wrote that number down instead. I hope that wasn't too confusing. If you're interested in that, I'll put a couple links down below that I learned from. But what this all amounts to is a very reasonable interpretation of what this beast and this mark could have symbolized in the first century. It gets us on the track to make the whole view a little bit more reasonable. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the Whore of Babylon and how that relates to the tribulation. So again, if you're not familiar with this character, she shows up in the 17th chapter of Revelation. Here we are described seeing a woman who's finely dressed. She's sitting on the beast at one point, and she's drunk on the blood of the martyrs. So immediately we know whatever this character is, they are persecuting Christians. After that, we're given a little bit more on what this woman is and what she represents. Explicitly, we're told that she is a great city, which is a really nice detail to have. It narrows the field down quite a bit. And after we're told that, we're told something interesting that happens to this character. And that's that the beast and things associated with the beast actually turn on her and they destroy her. They devour her flesh and they set her ablaze. And this is kind of a weird thing. If you're reading through your first time, you might wonder, okay, why is it that this city that is persecuting Christians is now turned on by a satanic force represented by the beast and all of the other things gathering around it? It's a weird thing to make sense of. But what we can do from a preterist viewpoint is look back in history and say, okay, do we see anything in history that lines up with this? And again, the answer is yes. That being the city of Jerusalem. We know that early in Christian history, the Jewish people were persecuting Christians. I mean, just look at what Paul was doing. That was fully sanctioned by the Jewish authorities. going out persecuting Christians. So that makes sense of the first half of it, this woman being drunk on the blood of martyrs. But what about the second half, about the pagan nations, well, what we know to be Rome turning against it? And of course, this perfectly makes sense with what happened in history, because in 70 AD, the Roman Empire went and sacked the king of Jerusalem, totally decimated it. So then we do have something in history that fits this Whore of Babylon quite well. We have a great city that persecutes Christians, and in that way is perhaps seated on the power of the satanic beast. And we have it actually turning against her in the end and destroying her. But what goes even further past that is if we actually go back and read descriptions of what happened at the Siege of Jerusalem, which is what I did at the recommendation of some of the articles I was reading. Specifically, if you look at what Josephus, the first century historian, has to say about it. And what you find very quickly is not only is this a great description of, well, for one, flesh being devoured and fire being used to destroy this city, but it also lines up with a lot of things stated through the whole tribulation passage with the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls. For instance, a few things that I found. Jerusalem is described as having a whole bunch of its wildlife scorched, things that were once lush and beautiful now being described as a desert, which sounds a lot like one of the plagues that comes down, burning up 1/3 of all the trees and the grass on the planet. You also have details of bodies being stacked up like crazy, which sounds like the carnage described in Revelation. There's also a horrifying detail Josephus describes of the blood of all the murdered people flowing so much that it actually starts putting fires out in the city, which sounds a lot like rivers of blood as described in some of the plagues. Additionally, you have fire, a whole lot of fire, the entire city being described as burning down, which again lines up pretty well with some of the tribulation messaging of fire being thrown down on the earth. Most of all, though, there's a quote taken from a guy named Titus at the time who was leading the sack of Jerusalem. You see, at a certain point, after going through the city, seeing how fortified it was after the victory, he looked at the advantages the Jews had and saw what a disadvantage they were at trying to take it over, and he came to this conclusion. Quoting from Josephus, he says, "We have certainly had God as our assistant in this war, and it was no other than God who ejected the Jews out of these fortifications. For what could the hands of men or any machines do towards overthrowing these towers?" And what I think is interesting about that is even the people at the time looking at what were happening were interpreting it as some sort of divine judgment that God was bringing against this city and this people, which again sounds a lot like what's happening through the tribulation narrative. God is unsealing his judgment and casting it down upon the earth. All this to say, there's a lot of things in history that line up really well with the book of Revelation if we read it carefully and symbolically and in its context of a book written of prophecy to first century people. This by no means is a comprehensive way of looking at it, and I'm sure there's tons more questions that you might have regarding this. And I don't mean to answer them all because, again, I'm not an expert on this. But what I hope this has done is maybe opens you up to the idea that Revelation can be read from a preterist viewpoint. We can look at this book as prophecy mostly already have being fulfilled, although there is, of course, still the second coming of Christ that we all have to look forward to. If you did find any of that interesting, I suggest looking into it more. It's fascinating stuff. I'll put a couple links down to stuff that I used when I was researching for the class I ran on this, and I hope you find that helpful.